I want to start this next session as we look at the book of Jude. And this is about contending for the faith. And I want to say probably out of all the books of, definitely all the books of the New Testament, probably out of the books of the Bible, I would say Jude is probably my favorite book. Uh, Not in its shortness, but in its uh, quick delivery of an important message that we need to contend for the faith. And so I would say that out of the books, that Jude is probably my favorite book. Jude opens up and he says in verse 1, Jude, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, the brother of James. Now, which Jude are we talking about? There are several Judes listed in the New Testament. There's obviously Judas Iscariot in Matthew chapter 10. Most likely, it's definitely not Judas Iscariot. Nobody would have accepted a book written by Judas Iscariot because of his betrayal. We also know that shortly after his betrayal, he hangs himself, and so definitely not Judas Iscariot. There's in Acts chapter 15, verse 22, there's what we call Jude the Apostle, or Jude the Prophet, and but that's all we know about him. So most likely not a book written by someone we don't know a lot about. There is Jude, the brother of Jesus. This would have been a half-brother of Jesus. And then there's also Judas, the son of James, who was another apostle. And really, we don't know a lot about him either. So really, there's not a lot of doubt that this is Jude, the brother of Jesus and James. And if you remember that this James is the author of the book of James, and both James and Jude are half-brothers of Jesus. They're not half Jesus. Let me erase that. Where's my eraser? I can't erase it. So cross that out like that. They are half-brothers of Jesus is what I was trying to write, but didn't get it out. So Jude and James, half-brother of Jesus, but they both identify themselves not as Jesus' brothers, but as bondservants. And the reason is because they're trying to get their message across without using who they're related to get that message out there. Some people believe that this book is Pseudepigrapha. Remember, that it comes, it's attributed to somebody but not written by them, and comes well after his lifetime. So some arguments for that would be, in verse 17, he talks about the predictions of the apostle appears to look back as if it were already over. So this would have been, this is written well past the time of the apostolic age, which was the first century. And so therefore it's looking back, so it's written much later. Some say that verse 3 speaks of the faith as a fixed body, which would not have been gotten to that point. And some say that the Greek is too good for somebody like Jude, who was probably a peasant. Now, I think there's no reason to doubt Jude as authentic in this case. I think that the date leading to a late 60s date gives us a great accurate time. I believe it comes after 2 Peter. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. We did not discuss this issue in the video of 2 Peter, so we're going to discuss it here. I think 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about the scoffers being in the future, because that would have been around the mid-60s, and now in the late 60s, they are in the present. I think it was written before AD 70. Again, that's when the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem, and there was a greater scattering, and so written before that. So probably in the late 60s, 68, somewhere in there. Now, he's writing to anybody. Oops, sorry, I clicked too fast. It's really to any Christian. It's just a general letter. He's writing to just anybody who gets the letter. Jude does not seem to have a certain audience in mind. Some have suggested maybe Antioch, maybe Asia Minor. I think that guess is purely out there. I don't think there's any concrete evidence either way. But Jude is he's writing his letter to believers in general. And much like the destination, I think where he's writing from is also guesswork. Could be from Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians 9:5 suggested that maybe the brothers of the Lord traveled. But to what extent did they travel is purely guess. It's unknown really if Jude even went out of the Palestinian region. Now, what is certain is, what is Jude writing about? Well, Jude is writing about the nature of false teachers. And again, 2 Peter chapter 2 and the book of Jude have a lot in common. Jude discusses the idea of antinomianism. Antinomianism is an ethical system that denies the nature of external laws, and that those follow that the Old Testament is no longer needed. We just get rid of the entire Old Testament. He's talking about non-Christian mystics who have this power and idea about what comes, and about defiling the body. And he writes to energize the church. Man, just get back for the faith. He opens up and says, hey, I was going to write this great letter about the faith and all the good things, but I've got to address these issues. And so he denounces them for the conduct, but he encourages them to deal with these things and to address these issues. He says in Jude chapter 3, Beloved, I am making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, but now I feel the need to write to encourage you to contend for the faith that once and for all was handed down to the holy ones. Now, one of the great issues that is discussed, and we're going to deal with these two here, is the issue to relationship to 2 Peter. There are only a few verses in Jude that are not paralleled in 2 Peter, and only 2 Peter in chapter 2, verse 17, and Jude, verse 13, are really close in wording, but there's a lot of ones that are paralleled. And so we have a couple options. One, Jude had Peter as a source, so that would mean that Peter is first and Jude is second. Peter had Jude as a source, so here Jude would be first and Peter would be second. Both drew on an oral tradition, or both drew on a common written tradition. Now, I think one of the things that we can see is understanding is if we give Jude the priority, that means Jude comes first, and 2 Peter, or Peter used Jude in writing 2 Peter, would be the priority that Jude is shorter, which usually gives the priority. Kind of going all the way back to the Synoptic Gospels, it's one of the reasons for Mark being the priority. Jude shows greater spontaneity. He kind of just hits things kind of quickly. It's more likely that Peter excised allusions and Jude added them. Jude's Greek is a little bit more polished, and the use of Apocryphal material have been more understandable earlier than later. Now, if we think 2 Peter is the priority, Jude mentions previous words. He says, hey, you've already heard these things before, most likely from trying to point at my computer screen, and y'all can't see what I'm pointing at 2 Peter. Jude uses present tense, Peter uses first tense. Peter would not quote from somebody that he believed to be a lesser person. Jude wrote hastily and probably maybe incorporated a lot of 2 Peter. Now, excuse me, I went too far. For me, personally, I believe 2 Peter is the priority. I think 2 Peter comes first. Remember, this probably comes around 64 AD. It's a big D. Jude may be coming 68 AD. So for me, I believe that Jude is Peter is the priority, and Jude comes second. Another issue is Jude's use of what is called apocryphal material. Now that is material that's not included, that is not in the canon. Now there's some question about that. Jude cites directly two apocryphal works. One is called The Assumption of Moses, and the other is from a book called 1 Enoch in chapter 1, verse 9. Now, both of them are given close look because Jude's quotation, but and some defended that they should be included, but the majority doubt that because of there's questions about the authorship and who wrote it. However, there's indication that Jude thought they were inspired. Jude uses them. I don't think to the point that he necessarily believed that they were inspired. But the end, he does quote from them. Now, the problem is, I don't necessarily see a problem with Jude citing from these two books. It's kind of like if you're writing a paper for class and you read a book or an article and you include that in your paper. It's not original to you, but somebody wrote it. You're not citing that is the ultimate source. You're just quoting from that. And I think the same thing. If I'm preparing a message and I read a book by an author and I quote that in my sermon, I'm not quoting that book as authoritarian, that it's scripture. I'm just giving information. I think that's what Jude is doing here. So here are the key facts. Jude, this is the brother of Jesus and James. We don't know the destination. We also don't really know the province, although I put Jerusalem. Probably in the late 60s. And to warn Christians about false teachers, to contend for the faith. And then verse 3 is the key verse about, I was going to write to you, but I got to write to you about contending for the faith. Finish up your assignments for the week. Make sure that you're keeping up with that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.